Hello, Year 12. This is Mr. Ferreira, and I'm going to introduce a new topic in the Year 12 part of the psychology course, and it's simply a topic called attachment. Now, this is a very important part of psychology because if we think about kind of what psychology is meant to be about understanding human behavior, it seems important that we should look at kind of infant behavior and look at kind of this special relationship between a child and an adult or child and a parent. And so therefore, I'm going to introduce this because I'll teach the content in separate videos for you. And so we're kind of going to be asking the question, what is attachment? And maybe spend some time thinking about how you use the word. So people often say, oh, I'm really attached to that particular pair of shoes, or they are saying, oh, don't, you know, uh, kind of hurt my dog because I'm quite attached to it, or something along those lines. So think about the question, kind of, how do you use the word attachment and kind of what context it could be. The next thing, think about whether attachment is to something living versus something not living. So, for example, can you be attached to your phone? Or is attachment that we have towards a pet going to be very similar towards a child? So maybe think about that. What I often talk about is that attachment, in terms of psychology, ends up being quite important for the living. It's not to say that we don't miss people potentially if they pass away, but it is something which is quite important because you think about it, something like a phone. Would you, if I offered you a brand new phone to replace your existing phone, would you simply get rid of it? So if previously you're thinking, oh, I love my phone, I don't want to get rid of it, I could never be without it, and now suddenly I'm offering a new one, kind of what is the difference there? But this is kind of moving away from what the course is requiring of us. Part of this is just to introduce this idea of what is attachment. So let's look at a definition. It comes from Schaffer, who's a very important kind of researcher in terms of early childhood attachment. And Schaffer says attachment is a long enduring, emotionally meaningful tie to a particular individual. So we see that attachment is long enduring. In other words, it's not something which happens just straight away. I know that you could have an attachment to a child in terms of love and affection towards a child. That's almost immediate. But in terms of the term attachment that we're going to look at, it is long enduring. It takes a while for us to get there. It also says it's emotionally meaningful. In other words, there's something important about this, and it's a particular tie. So if you think about if you're trying to tie something, you can't tie, you've got to have more than one aspect tied together. So even a piece of string, we tie the two ends together. If you think about what a tie would be. Then it says the object of their attachment is generally someone, most often parent, who returns the child's feeling. So we don't say it has to be the parent. It says it's most often the parent, and that there's this element of returning the child's feelings. So that's another thing you could potentially say about an inanimate object. And I know that there are people who have an overly kind of strong kind of feelings towards kind of their cars or kind of objects or things within their houses. But I would hope that you can see that potentially in terms of psychologically, there's not this reciprocal idea of returning the emotional bond. And then we see the last aspect of this. It says that the tie can be extremely powerful and emotionally laden in both directions. And that's perhaps going to be a kind of a good concept for us to kind of consider, that even though we're looking at early infant attachment, there's certainly this idea that it kind of goes in both directions. Now that's a good enough definition for us. I know that the specification doesn't say anything about what that you need to know definition for attachment, but I've seen enough questions for me to be wary and just simply ask the question that if they ask us to study a topic, that we do need to know what it is. There's a couple of other people who have written about attachment. Most of them seem to have kind of common ideas. We see this particular one says intense emotional between two people, so it does actually mention people there. And also think about this idea of causing stress or sorrow if that particular kind of attachment figure was separated from you. I quite like that one there. We also see here that attachment now gets an age frame, saying attachment is an important part of infancy between birth and 2 years of age. And it says to ensure the baby is well cared for. So now we're seeing a bit of a purpose for why we would have attachment at this particular time. It says it gives the feelings of security necessary before exploration of the environment will occur. So it could be that actually attachment does have a very strong role to play within our lives. And this attachment topic, I think, is pretty much one of the topics that has existed over a long time in the psychology course. I think it's really important. Only thing I'd probably say to you is that don't get hung up on this idea that it's either something which is not kind of as cool as social psychology, or that it suits a particular type of people. In fact, it's a course that you need to kind of look at the specification and see how you can achieve the best you can. Certainly, when I was at university, it was one of the areas which, even though I may not have enjoyed some of the content, I certainly was able to achieve good grades in it. And also the reason that I teach it as well, because obviously my children are actually younger, and therefore I've kind of gone through these particular experiences kind of more recently. Just looking briefly at what the content is. Okay, so first of all, we'll cover in another loom that I will record today, this idea of caregiver-infant interactions. And so we look at a specific part of that, and we have now labels called interactional, synchrony, and reciprocity. We also asked to look at multiple attachments and the role of the father. Now, this is actually fairly new to the attachment course. It's kind of was reintroduced back into your specification, and therefore it's quite a nice kind of way of looking at this. And also know that the second edition of the textbook that we have has a lot more kind of detail on the role of the father than what the first edition does. We then move on to animal studies. Now, we used to always study Lorenz and Harlow, but now they've actually named them and put them part of the specification, so we kind of did a bit more detail. Once we've covered that, we go to the first explanation part of the course, and we see that there are two explanations, so learning theory and Bowlby's theory, that we have to look at. And it's only really under Bowlby's theory that they ask us to look at the critical period and internal working model. So we need to kind of make sure we cover those topics when we get there. Once we've studied what is attachment, how does attachment come about, and the animals that we're then actually quite strangely at this particular point, we look at what types of attachment there are. So up until this particular point, we may not have given any specific name to attachment, but we see here that we need to name them secure, insecure avoidant, and insecure resistant. And we kind of end this off with this, looking at some cultural aspects of the course as well. Then, in my opinion, we take a bit of a step back. I'm not sure why they've reintroduced this, but I suppose it's moving on to this idea of kind of making this assumption that if secure attachment is the best attachment to have, well, what happens if there is some kind of deprivation? So what happens if there isn't a secure attachment being formed? And we get asked to look at Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation, and we also get asked to look at the Roman orphan studies, and they give us this kind of title of effects of institutionalization. So what happens if a child is brought up in an orphanage, for example? And then to end all of this, to make it kind of from basically birth to adulthood, we do see is there something, it says the influence of attachment, okay, the influence and attachment on relationships. So is it possible that your early childhood relationships can affect your adult relationships or affect your friendships and things like that. And once again, we go back to the role of the internal working model. So we see we have a repeat of the internal working model here, as we did over here, internal working model. And we also see the name Bowlby appear twice. Now, they're two different contexts, so I would recommend you take each of these bullet points and you kind of revise them for what they are. Thank you for that. This is the introduction to attachment, and in my next video, I will go through to caregiver-infant interaction.